Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on flood risk in residential property transactions. We have a nice little schedule for you today. In the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'm going to share with you various aspects of flood risk, legislation, facts, and we'll also have a look at some case studies. Now, a copy of the slides and a recording of the webinar can be made available to you after the webinar, so please don't hesitate to ask. You should see a panel on your screen which allows you to ask written questions. So please feel free to submit any as we go, and I'll try and get these answered for you either during the webinar or afterwards. If you're using a Windows PC or Mac, you should see that there are some product cards visible in your control panel, and if you click on those, they should download automatically. There'll be a short feedback survey at the end of the webinar, and we're always looking at ways to improve our presentations, so it would be really great if you could take a few seconds to fill out the 3 questions we've got on hand. So let's get started. So why does anybody need a flood report? Flooding is a growing risk for British property. Aside from the physical damage caused by floods, if a property is at risk of flooding, it may make it difficult to obtain a mortgage, obtain suitable insurance cover, or to actually be able to sell the property, all of which are likely to impact the overall value of the property. Now, a flood can threaten your safety, can cause serious damage to the property and its relocation contents, and can result in many, many months of disruption. Now, the ABI, or the Association of British Insurers, recently found out that fewer than 1 in 3 people researched the flood risk of a property before buying their current home. Home buyers are more likely to look into the ease of parking in the area than check whether their current house could be at the risk of flooding. Now, flooding can have several impacts on property, primarily structural damage, contamination, and reduce the value of a property. In terms of contamination, floodwater can be contaminated with sewage from blocked drains and chemicals from people's garages or commercial premises that have spilled into the floodwater. Now, once floodwater has receded, a layer of contaminated silt is often quite left behind. Mold can grow in the damp conditions following flooding. And contamination can actually add to the cost of cleaning and disinfecting buildings that have been flooded. And contaminated floodwater can also create some risks to human health. Now, you've also got the seller's information form, or the TA6. Now, the TA6 asks the question of the seller: has any part of the property, whether buildings or surrounding garden or land, ever been flooded, with a simple yes or no answer. Now, to be honest, that's not really a huge amount of detail, and a caveat emptor, buyer beware, should be employed here and further investigations undertaken in every transaction. Now, in section 6.14 of the CML handbook, it states that you must make reasonable inquiries to satisfy yourself that buildings insurance has been arranged for the property from no later than completion. You should remind the borrower that they must have buildings insurance in accordance with the requirements of the mortgage contract no later than completion, and must maintain such buildings insurance throughout the mortgage term. And we will actually cover off insurance a little bit further on down in this particular presentation. Back in 2007, there was the Pitt Review. So the Pitt Review and the lessons learned from the 2007 floods was prepared by Sir Michael Pitt following the widespread flooding that took place in England in June and July of 2007. The 505-page report was commissioned by the Secretary of State for Environment, Flood and Rural Affairs, and the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, and the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. The report put forward 92 recommendations covering prediction and warning of flooding, prevention, emergency management, resilience, and recovery. Conducting a flood search was one of the key recommendations provided in the Pitt Review. Recommendation number 63 was flood risk should be made part of the mandatory search requirements when people buy property. Now, following the abolition of HIPs, or the Home Information Packs, There is no longer a real legal requirement for an investigation of flood risks in the home buying process. However, it is likely that where a home is at risk of flooding, prospective purchasers or their advisors will commission an environmental search which addresses flood risk in line with the Law Society guidance to solicitors and make an informed decision as to whether to proceed. Now, flood risk should be at the forefront of every property transaction. The Law Society practice note on flood risk states that in all conveyancing transactions, when acting for a prospective buyer, tenant, or lender, a solicitor should mention the issue of flooding to the client and, where appropriate, make further investigations. These include the following: conducting searches using a professional organization, making inquiries of the seller. However, a caveat emptor should be applied here, and instructing a valuer or surveyor to carry out an appropriate physical inspection, survey, or evaluation generally, and to provide advice on the impact of flooding. So the practice note aims to provide solicitors with information to help your clients investigate the terms on which buildings insurance cover, including flood risk, is available prior to entering into contractual commitments. Your clients should be encouraged to make sure insurance can be obtained for the property on acceptable terms before entering into a contract. So what does the Law Practice Society note actually mean? So the Law Society Chief Executive Desmond Hudson said flooding has the potential to impact a huge swathe of property transactions. Some clients may perceive that flooding only occurs if you live near a river, but the majority of damage caused by flood is from groundwater, surface water, or sewer flooding, none of which necessarily relates to rivers or low-lying grounds. Apart from the physically damaging impact of floods, if a property is at risk, it may be difficult to obtain a mortgage or insurance to cover the property. Solicitors are there to help buyers, tenants, and lenders in residential and commercial transactions to understand the options available to them. The practice note states that in all conveyancing transactions, when acting for a prospective buyer, tenant, or lender, you should mention the issue of flood risk. Again, I think it's really just trying to hammer the point home of making sure that everybody's informed. Now, in a new publication by the Environment Agency released in December 2016, it saw the number of properties at risk of flooding increase significantly. The figures show that 3.2 million properties are now at risk of surface water and 2.7 million properties are at risk of river and coastal flooding. The report also saw the individual properties are moving into higher risk categories. So properties at high risk of surface water flooding have risen by 13% since 2013-14, and those at high risk of flooding from rivers or the sea have increased by around 10% over the same period. This will come as a blow to DEFRA, which sets its own objective to reduce flood and coastal erosion risk to 300,000 homes by March 2021. There are also more than 700 properties that the EA predicts could be lost to coastal erosion by 2030, and more than 2,000 could be lost by 2060. Even when planned interventions are taken into account, without beach or seawall maintenance, the EA says 28,000 properties would be lost by 2060. In addition to that, almost 6 million people live and work in flood risk areas, with more than 50% of water treatment plants in England and Wales at risk of flood. 14% of electricity infrastructure is also at risk, and with over 2,358 schools at risk of flood. So it's pretty important to take into account that just because a property or your home isn't in a flood risk area, that doesn't actually mean that you're not going to be affected by flood in some way, shape, or form, particularly when it comes to things like water treatment plants being at risk or electricity infrastructure. So even if your house isn't on a floodplain, if your electricity grid nearby is, you're going to be out of power for quite a long time. The total cost of floods in 2015 exceeded £5 billion. So that's an estimate. that the total combined cost of 2015 winter floods was costing between 5 and 5.8 billion pounds based on insured losses, underinsurance, local authority and infrastructure costs, business loss funding gap, flood defenses, or changes to the insurance industry model. It's quite a lot of money, and it's quite a shocking amount of facts to see. Now I thought we would have a look at some case studies. As you can see on the screen, there's three storms there. So you've got Storm Eva, Storm Desmond, both affecting Leeds and Lancaster. So in December 2015, it was considered the wettest, warmest December since records began in 1910, with temperatures 4.1 degrees above the 1981 to 2010 average. Now, following the severe impacts of 3 successive storms, it's imperative for anyone looking to purchase either residential or commercial property to thoroughly assess flood risk ahead of purchase. Now, Storm Desmond hit at the beginning of December and was quickly followed by Storm Eva and Storm Frank. The most severe flooding occurred between the 25th and the 27th of December across Yorkshire, Lancashire, and Greater Manchester. Now, in partnership with JBA Risk Management, we analyzed some of the worst hit areas. As you can see from the images on the screen, the areas that were affected correspond with those modeled to be at risk by flood specialist JBA. So how did these events occur? Now, the combination of heavy rainfall and saturated ground are likely contributors to the extreme flooding that we saw that winter. Overland flow caused by surface water runoff would have led to many rivers and streams bursting their banks and inundating the surrounding towns and villages. And the effects of this, basically, Storm Desmond brought severe gales and localized flooding to many parts of northwest England, resulting in 5,200 homes flooding in Cumbria and Lancaster. Storm Eva quickly followed by Frank, causing flooding to parts of West Yorkshire and Lancashire, flooding 9,000 properties and bringing the total number of flooded properties to around 16,000 homes, some of which may have actually flooded multiple times. The storms have impacted thousands of businesses. One council in the northwest estimated over 1,600 business premises were flooded. PricewaterhouseCoopers have estimated that around 50% of the claims will be from the commercial businesses. Traditionally, these figures are between 20 and 30%. This is due to floods hitting towns and cities, affecting more small and medium-sized businesses. Now, the average cost of flood damage is approximately £28,000. That's almost 4 times higher than the cost of a fire. However, the 2015-2016 were atypical, with the average cost of each domestic claim reaching around £50,000. This reflects the extensive damage caused to properties not only by the inundation of water, but also the damage caused by the structure of a property as well as contamination from floodwaters. From a residential perspective, a flooded home is costly not only in terms of money and time, but also in terms of emotional upheaval, ill health, and inconvenience. Now, previously, those living in high-risk flood areas were subject to extortionate insurance premiums, and in some cases, insurance not being available. Now, we've analyzed the JBA Flood Index, and that has identified that over 26% of properties in Lancaster would find obtaining insurance at an affordable price difficult to obtain. For Carlisle, this is about 7%, and for Leeds, around 4%. Now, it is really, really important to look at various sources of flood data. So you have, of course, river and coastal flooding, surface and groundwater. So you see a map on the left, the map on the right, and then an overlay of the two. As we say, it is always important to look at various different sources to really provide a complete picture. Data from the Environment Agency is good, but it's not fully complete and doesn't always have all of the additional information that one would like. So taking into account such as things as current or proposed flood defenses or areas benefiting from flood defenses. All of these things provide a much more complete picture to be able to provide better information for you and your client. Now, I thought we'd have a look at another example of some flooding. Now, in 2012, major flooding swept through the new Taylor-Wimpey development. Around 100 homes on the Taylor-Wimpey built Glastor estate in North Wales were left under 3 feet of water just over 2 years ago when floods struck following heavy downpours. Now, those forced to leave while work was carried out on their water-damaged homes have long since returned, but uncertainty continues to surround plans to build 60 other properties earmarked for the site, around 12 of which are partially built. In the wake of the deluge, some residents expressed concerns their homes built on the floodplain would lose value because of the vulnerability exposed by those November 2012 floods. Now, Taylor-Wimpey has never restarted the work on Glastor, where homes were marketed for between £140,000 and £250,000. It has previously said it had to secure confidence from existing and future customers to actually complete the build. Now, it doesn't help that the development lies within a floodplain and is at risk of surface water flooding, something which is becoming more common with new developments as we build over previously permeable surfaces. Now, the newly built Glastor estate did have a flood defense system in place, estimated to protect against a 1 in 1,000 year incident, yet 122 homes were badly flooded in November 2012. Now, an independent report into the disaster was undertaken and found that the culvert screens were blocked, were of poor design, and didn't comply with any recognized standard. These particular culverts were the responsibility of the local authority. Current guidance said such grills were not even necessary for safety reasons on such large culverts and should be left off so debris, such as vegetation, shopping trolleys, and all sorts of rubbish that people tend to throw out, that is left in ditches and brought down when it's wet, can flow through. The Glastor flood defenses would have been very effective but for the actual blockage that occurred. The area had been previously estimated to be protected, again, as I mentioned earlier, in a 1 in 1,000 year event. But of course, that estimate had not factored in the effect of blocked culvert grills, and I'm sure it wasn't expecting shopping carts and all sorts of vegetation to be blocking those grills. Now, each year, around 10,000 homes are built in a floodplain. This equates to 1 in 14 homes. In the 5 years since 2011-2012, 1,228 residential units have been given the green light after the Environment Agency advice was overruled. The Environment Agency figures show that it has raised objections on flood risk grounds in more than 14,000 planning applications since 2011-2012. Of those where its decision is known as the agency's objections have been overruled or partially overruled on 330 occasions. One single application included nearly 1,000 residential units, while another had more than 500. Many of the properties were in flood zone 3, the highest level of flood risk, including several where there was concern over risk to life or property, or the development was next to a watercourse or flood defenses. Where buildings in these areas is being considered, councils must ensure that suitable alternative sites at lower flood risks are not available, that new developments will be resistant to flooding and safe for its lifetime, and flood risk will not be increased elsewhere. At the end of the day, the Environment Agency is only a consultee who provides advice. The final decision rests with local planning authorities. On April 6, 2015, the government's new planning policy on eco-friendly sustainable drainage systems at new major housing developments came into effect. The overriding aim of the policy is to lessen the likelihood and impact of surface water flooding from new developments by encouraging the use of sustainable drainage systems, or in other words known as SUDs. As a consequence, lead local flood authorities have also been made statutory consultees, and new non-statutory guidance has been published under the changes. Now, the government's decision on the increased use of SUDs has long been awaited and surrounded in controversy. Initially, it was proposed that SUDs should be approved before development commences by a body set up by local authorities and ensure that SUDs are designed according to national standards. Now, there was a concern amongst developers that the system could cause delays to developments as a result of second approval being required. There was also concern that approval bodies might not be fully prepared to cope with their new duties in a timely manner. Further, the Flood and Water Management Act 2010 requires local planning authorities to adopt and maintain approved SUDs which are functioning properly and serve more than one property. Now, to protect the public while avoiding excessive burdens on the business, this policy will apply to all developments of 10 homes or more and to major commercial development. The government will keep this under review and consider the need to make adjustments when necessary. The current requirements in national policy that all new developments in areas of risk of flooding should give priority to the use of sustainable drainage systems, which will continue to apply. Now, under the new regime, local planning policies and decisions on planning applications in relation to major developments, so to those of 10 dwellings or more, to ensure the sustainable drainage systems for the management of runoff are put in place unless demonstrated to be inappropriate. Clear non-statutory technical standards for SUDs has been produced by the government, working closely with Environment Agency, local authorities and developers to reduce the risk of surface water flooding, improve water quality and the environment to ensure that SUDs are robust, safe, and affordable. In addition, according to the new planning policy, local planning authorities are expected, when considering planning applications, to consider SUDs in connection with a planning application, consult the relevant lead local flood authority on the management of surface water, to satisfy themselves that the proposed minimum standards of operation are appropriate, and to ensure through the use of planning conditions or planning obligations that there are clear arrangements in place for ongoing maintenance over the lifetime of the development. The operation and ongoing maintenance of SUDs must also be economically proportionate. Now, I thought we'd start looking at insurance, and particularly Flood Re, or the Flood Reinsurance Scheme that was released last year. So Section 6.14 of the CML Handbook states that you, as the solicitor, must make reasonable inquiries to satisfy yourself that building insurance has been arranged for the property from no later than completion. You should remind the borrower that they must have buildings insurance in accordance with the requirements of the mortgage contract no later than completion and must maintain buildings insurance throughout the mortgage term. Now, Flood Reinsurance, or Flood Re as it's now called, has been set up to help the insurance industry offer affordable insurance to everyone owning or living in eligible properties that may be prone to flooding. So how does Flood Re work? So Flood Re collects an annual tax from every home insurer in the UK. That tax contributes 180 million to a fund each year that is managed centrally. Your insurer passes on the flood risk part of your policy to us, so you don't have to do anything. And when we then take responsibility for that part of your policy, and if you make a valid claim on your insurance, we'll reimburse the insurer from the central Flood Re fund. So Flood Re has been tied to council tax banding as well. Now, Flood Re is great, but there are a lot of inclusions as well as a lot of exclusions, and we strongly suggest that you have a look at the website to make sure that a property is actually valid for Flood Re insurance. I'm going to name some of the criteria to be able to meet Flood Re, and also I'll try and list some of the exclusions. So properties will be eligible only if they meet all of the following criteria for Flood Reinsurance. Point 1, they are covered by an insurance contract which is held in the name of or on trust for one or more individuals or by the personal representative of an individual. Point 2, the holder of the policy or their immediate family must live in the property for some or all of the time, or the property must be unoccupied. Point 3, they have a domestic council tax band of A to H or equivalent. Point 4, they are used for private residential purposes. Point 5, they are a single residential unit or building comprising of 2 or 3 residential units. Point 6, they are insured on an individual basis or have an individual premium. Point 7, they were built before the 1st of January 2009. And the last point is they are located within the UK comprising England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. We expect that the following properties will be eligible for buildings or combined cover provided they also meet the criteria 1 to 8 above. So I could actually list a whole bunch of these conditions, but the long and the short of it is commercial properties are not included in Flood Re. That includes things like bed and breakfasts, any type of buy-to-lets, they're not included. So again, it is very, very important that you have a look at what the inclusions are for Flood Re and exclusions. And I could list all of them here today, but I actually want to give you the rest of your day back. Please do give us a shout should you need more information on Flood Re. Now, this is probably one of the final points I'm going to go into today. The ground shore residential flood searches will provide the highest possible flood risk within 25 meters of the center of the property. So we do this as the reports are point-based, and it ensures that all the property's assets are covered. Now, however, this can sometimes encompass areas outside of the property boundary. In these cases, we offer a service called a manual flood assessment, whereby we look at the flood risk to a property slightly differently and where possible lower risk to the property itself by taking into account the risk within the property boundary rather than within 25 meters. So our in-house consultants will expertly assess whether a manual assessment is possible before any exchange of money. And if it is possible, then they will undertake the assessment and provide an amended report for you. Not everybody really knows that that is possible, so I thought it would be really important to let you guys know. And finally, that brings us back to the report. So if you would like a standalone report whereby you've already purchased an environmental report, you can purchase a separate flood report, which is our ground shore flood report. It's really easy to read. It provides an overall flood risk, gives you the risk for surface water, groundwater, river and coastal water flood risks. It looks at things like current and proposed flood defenses, and also provides a property-specific statement as to whether or not the property will be ceded into Flood Re for residential purposes. Should you require an environmental and a flood report, then the home buyers provides everything that you would find in a full flood report, but in addition to that, it provides contaminated land contaminated land assessment. So for an environmental perspective, so it's the original combined report, and it will provide. It basically fulfills all the requirements of due diligence under the Law Practice Society note for both contaminated land as well as flood risk. And finally, as always, we provide ongoing support. So as part of our customer services, we will always aid and provide advice to anybody that's involved in the transaction. We can discuss the results of any of our reports and provide further recommendations should you need to. So if you do have a client that has a lot of questions, please feel free to pass them on to us directly, and we will be more than happy to take their questions off your hands and be able to provide as much environmental and flood support as required. It's kind of one of the things that we pride ourselves in, is working with house purchasers who have a lot of questions. So again, our contact details are on all the reports, and should you have any pernickety clients with lots of questions, send them our way, and we'll make sure to look after them for you. And that's it. It was nice and short and sweet today. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you for joining me. We hope you found today's session useful. Now, please feel free to contact us if you'd like a copy of the slides or a recording of the webinar. And as I mentioned earlier, there'll be a quick feedback survey that will launch shortly after this. And we always appreciate all of your feedback and recommendations. So again, thank you again for spending a bit of time with us today, and hopefully you found it useful, and we will speak to you soon. Thanks very much.